All right, welcome everyone to the first Flex Canada coaching webinar of 2024. Hope everyone had a nice restful holiday. My name is John LaFranco. I'm the manager of coaching education with Flex Canada. Kyle Smith, our coaching coordinator, is in the background, sort of being he's in the producer role. So he'll be the one sort of managing your questions as they come in and stuff. And I'm really excited to have with us today two of Athletics Canada's, I guess, I don't know, stars, it's a good word, Heather Hennigar and Trent Stellingwerff, and we're going to talk about altitude training. So great topic. And just before we started, there were some really great conversations and stuff that were going on. So there's so much good content. So just before we start, everyone's muted. If you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A dialog box, and Kyle will get to them. We've got a bunch of set questions. We're going to kind of go through, have a little conversation, and then at the end, if we have time and if the questions are not answered in our main talk, then we'll go through some of those questions. Vous pouvez demander des questions en français. I will translate for our panelists if they need it. And I can translate back into French if need be, or we can just have Heather do it. And then we get it French, right, Heather? And finally, the coaches who have entered their NCCP number and are NCCP certified will get one PD point for their participation in the webinar. And after this one, our next one is going to be with international official Jane Edstrom. We're calling it Rules Runway, Stride into Success with the latest track and field rules updates. And it's going to take place on February 15th, Thursday at 7 p.m. So if you have a love affair for the rules, make a date the day after Valentine's Day. Dad joke there for the dads. Yeah, we're going to learn all about the new rules. So that's coming up next. But now we're and the registration link is in the chat if you want to register for those rules right now. Okay, so without further ado, let's talk altitude. Got Heather and Trent here. Heather Hennigar, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and why we've got you as an expert on this panel?
My name's Heather Hennigar. I'm currently the lead out at the West Hub, Athletics Canada's hub out in Victoria, and I was the former endurance coach for Athletics Canada for a number of years. I am no longer in a coaching role, other than I'm still coaching Nate Reish, who's a Paralympian in 1500 meters. Many probably know Nate. And so in terms of altitude, I started off in my running career as an 800-meter runner, spent quite a bit of time up in Flagstaff. I've calculated, I think that I've been to over 21 altitude camps, mostly in a coaching capacity. Many of them sort of Athletics Canada national team camps that we started back in 2014. And so I think just earlier on the call, I was calculating, I probably spent almost 2 years accumulated up with very low amount of oxygen. But so that's just a little bit of my background. I am quite interested in altitude. I find it's a really interesting stimulus. And so I have invested in going to some of the altitude symposiums in Colorado Springs, et cetera, and continue to try to keep myself as updated as possible.
Great, thanks. And Trent Stellingwerff.
Yeah, hi, I'm Trent Stellingwerff. Work at the Canadian Sport Institute Pacific. For a bunch of years, I was the IST lead for Athletics Canada. I'm a senior physiologist at our institute, and also our research lead. And I guess I learned altitude initially by doing. My wife and I, Hillary, who's a two-time Olympian distance runner, lived in Switzerland for a bunch of years, and we got connected in with the Swiss Olympic group. And we're up at St. Moritz and actually participated in some research that the Swiss did in altitude with Christian Bell's way back in the day. If that's an old school name, some people might recognize. And Victor Rothman, the marathoner. And so when we moved back to Canada, I continued to utilize altitude, worked with Heather on various altitude camps up at Flagstaff and getting the sports science pieces set up. We've done some research projects up at altitude, and then I've had the honor to write a few papers and research projects around altitude training as well.
Great. Great. So we are well positioned here to learn a lot from these two fine individuals. So let's start. Just the first question. I mean, I think that most of our conversations can revolve around endurance running, but we did maybe want to start more generally. Like, is there a way that coaches can use altitude training in some of the other events in track and field and sprints and jumps, or is this really just like a distance running endurance thing?
I think that's a Heather question.
Oh, I was thinking it was a Trent question, but I will say well, a couple things. One of the camps I was at, it was funny. I hadn't really conceptualized that was a thing, and outside of endurance, and lo and behold, I ran into Dylan Armstrong and Bondarchuk up there. And if you think about it, and this is where maybe Trent can come in, but it shakes up the physiology for sure. And so, you know, there's a few pieces to that, but can definitely create a stimulus and a change, and some adaptation responses that translate across a number of events. There's some research in terms of speed power that probably Trent can speak to. You know, specifically for me, I have used it with sprinters. And so I found myself in a few situations where I was up at, you know, at altitude and had some sprinters and used it for some overspeed training type of stimulus, because obviously, you know, the reduced air resistance, and you can actually, you know, hit some higher speeds and sort of gain some confidence from that, and, you know, get that stimulus baked in. So I have done that. We're up in St. Moritz just this was pre-world championships in Doha, and I brought a couple of the pair of sprinters up, and I kept them up there for lower period of time because I wasn't really looking for the blood adaptations as much, but it definitely was a big confidence booster on that front. I'll hand it over to Trent.
Yeah, I think like Heather nailed those pieces. It is primarily an endurance adaptation tool. That said, there is time and a place in some athletes' careers, maybe when they're looking for a different stimulus, that they could consider that. As an endurance tool, we'll get into this more. Most of the research is around the increase in red blood cells, but an under research area definitely is an increase in muscle and blood buffering. And I do think at times for 200 and 400 runners, there could be more utilization, very specific short camps that could be considered. This is a little more hypothetical. I don't think it's systematically as leveraged as much as it could be around some of the buffering aspects to the long sprints. But otherwise, yeah, Heather kind of nailed it.
And Trent, in terms of lactic buffering capacity, that's generally about 10 days you can get a good adaptation response. Is that about right? Like between 7 and 10 days you can kind of.
Yeah, we kind of hypothesize that that's probably the window. There's, you know, I think there's only 3 research projects that have looked at blood and muscle buffering with altitude. And to do muscle buffering measurement, you need a muscle biopsy. So it's quite invasive, something I would never recommend to any of our AC athletes. Unfortunately, Gareth Sanford was a postdoc of mine, and we had a blood buffering study all set up to do in March or April of 2020. And then everyone remembers what happened in March of 2020, and that project didn't happen. But the small amount of data out there does suggest that the adaptations to having your blood buffer more lactate, so acidosis, and your muscle might be more on a 7 to 10 day window than the full 3-week camp. And anecdotally, I think a lot of middle distance coaches will bring their 800 specialists mid-season up for maybe just 7 or 10 days, and then drop out of, say, St. Moritz and into Monaco, and we've seen amazing performances. So it does fit with that window.
That's awesome. Okay, so good. So already I think we've learned something, some potential for sprinters. Maybe another webinar another time. We'll go deep into that. So for the endurance athlete, so where do you start? At what point should an endurance athlete consider going to altitude? Is there a certain sort of experience or training load that they would need to kind of max out at sea level first? Are there sort of any age considerations? Like, when do you start? Heather, what did you start practically speaking, and then Trent could tell us scientifically speaking, perhaps.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. I think one of the models I use generally, and I use it across a number of parameters, is kind of a pyramid in that, whether it's introducing, different changes in nutrition or, supplements and things like that, is that you want that base and foundation there. So those foundational pieces can be, across, just sort of high performance behaviors, but also, making sure that there's a good solid fitness foundation. And, just from a development perspective, it's good to introduce things slowly over a period of time. And so you can always, so every year you sort of have something to add. So altitude doesn't need to be something that's introduced right away with young endurance athletes. I will say, since 2014, at one point we even had a next gen project around it and brought a number of athletes in. It's kind of an introduction, and I do think there's benefit because it takes a long time to kind of nail it with altitude, and repeat exposure, not only within years but over years is beneficial. That education can start, actually quite early, but to have that be the sort of key piece strategically, within a year, I just don't think that young high school athletes necessarily that's beneficial. Yeah, I don't know if that sort of answered it, but definitely you want to make sure that the foundations are there, and you've got to be so dialed in. You've got to be fit, healthy, motivated, all of those things to really benefit from it. It is an icing on the cake kind of thing to some extent. So you do want to make sure that you've got all those basic foundational pieces in place first. There's so much, when you start off, like there's just so much you can build in every year in terms of, continuing aerobic gains and different pieces that you build in, that I don't think it necessarily needs to be, the step that you take early on.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. Especially for a younger athlete, I think you really got to also look at even early career professionals and seeing where they are in their trajectory, and also their ability to manage some of the lifestyle pieces that you need in place at altitude to make sure you get the full benefit, and things don't go sideways. So it probably doesn't make sense to take a kid running 40K a week who unfortunately maybe eats fast food too often. He's on his Game Boy to 4 a.m. There's a lot of other big rocks you can work on there before layering in altitude on top of that.
And actually, Trent made a good point there, the lifestyle piece. So, I mean, ideally, if we had in a perfect world, to utilize altitude, you might have three exposures a year. Doesn't happen that often, but many athletes do that, and in order to get a benefit, we'll get to that later, but the amount of time that you need to be there to accumulate sort of a gain, think of the impact on that for an athlete necessarily that's young, in terms of their social life and a number of other things. It's a major commitment.
Yeah, school too. Got to work
and
around that.
And school, yeah.
Yeah.
School.
Yeah. Okay. So another sort of maybe sort of basic or foundational question, like outside of there's individual differences clearly, but are there differences between how men and women would react at altitude? Is there any research on this, generally speaking?
I can do the research piece, and then Heather could answer the coaching piece maybe. Mm-hmm. I'll get on my soapbox here. Full stop. Our understanding of sex-based differences of physiologies in males and females is poor across the board. And as someone who does research, I got to raise my hand and continue to work hard to do well-controlled studies in females. So we don't know. There's just a handful of studies that have been well done, and they haven't actually sliced out and looked at differential results at altitude. I will say this, though. On average, females will have increased issues with low iron. And as a screening tool, you definitely have to pay more attention to female athletes around just hemoglobin and iron supplementation. You do with the males too. But that is definitely one point. There's lots of data to show, the anemia rates in females can be up to, in endurance females, up to 40 to 50%, and in males it's more like 10 to 20%. And the other piece that I'll say is because females tend to come in with lower hemoglobins than males. There's a 20% difference in hemoglobin between males and females on average. Because they have a lower baseline. In fact, the percent increase in hemoglobin they get at altitude can sometimes be more as a percent increase than male athletes. So physiologically, those are the major differences that we know between males and females. Maybe the one other point that I'll just make is that, and we'll probably get into training load monitoring, is whether sea level or altitude. Obviously, females run their mileage a little slower than males, so you always have to just think and account for that. And I think that a cumulative effect at altitude can have more effect because it takes longer to run. If you give 100 miles, I think the cumulative effect on females is a lot more at altitude than at sea level, because it takes 20% more steps, 20% longer on average. Those are the science answers. I don't know if coaching over all those camps over the years, if you can give some social differences or science differences that I've missed, Heather. But
I think one of the things, and maybe come back to this with some of the other questions too, is that over the course looking at trends and that kind of thing, I more and more it's defaulting to really looking at intent for an individual at whatever point in the stream they're at, and looking at individual variability. And there's probably more variability just amongst athletes and between genders. But some things I have noted, and this is probably more anecdotal, and Trent could fill in the gaps from the science perspective, but athletes that tend to have more muscle mass tend to fare a little, worse in some regards. And so, if you get a sort of larger built 800-meter type dude, sometimes they'll tend to suffer a little bit more at altitude and find it a little more difficult around some of the muscle buffering pieces. And so I have noted that over the years. Women tend to carry less muscle mass. So in that regard, that seems to be a bit of a benefit. I have noted that like some of the hormonal shifts that happen cyclically, like, in terms of menstrual cycles and things like that, can get impacted. Sometimes there's delayed menstrual cycles and things like that. And I do know in terms of recovery, some of those hormones can impact the ability to recover and that type of thing. So there's some variation there. Women in general tend to be more, men tend to be better at speed power. Women aerobically seem to have some capacities there. And then when you look at the duration of a given event, so even like an 800 or 1500, the contribution of aerobic versus anaerobic sometimes is sort of increased in women. And I do think altitude can, I would be more apt to take, sometimes, maybe a female 800-meter up than a male, depending, but there's some of those things as well. And then the individual variability, it's like, like one of the things that happens when you first go up, you get this, heart rate spike. And so I'm not going to gender this, but it's, it can be, if your heart rate goes up, sympathetically, it's similar to anxiety, and so sometimes with some athletes, you need to sort of talk them through, it's a sympathetic response. You might feel on edge, but actually, this is just, a response to altitude. So I'll go back to the individual variability piece, which I think is the most important thing as you look at who you got in front of you.
Yeah, know your athlete. And I think it also speaks to the importance of like close monitoring. Like, you can't just kind of go. You need a team. It needs to be structured and planned. The next question was going to be sort of similar, but with respect to para athletes, I assume the answer is going to be more of the same in terms of individual variation. But Heather, you do have obviously quite a lot of experience. Can you speak a bit to how you've maybe adjusted things for Nate or other para athletes that you're coaching?
Yeah, and so I I think, you know, when you look at the range amongst para athletes, you know, we call them para athletes, but really there's just, I mean, you've got visually impaired, you've got people with some, you know, CNS issues, you've got just such a range that it's really important with any para athlete to look at, number one, what's the intent of going? What do you want to achieve? You know, how are they designed physiologically, and how are you going to ensure that they're, you know, getting the benefit? And, you know, we've had para integrated camps since 2014. We had a visually impaired athlete in the first year, and we subsequently had athletes come up from para over the years. You know, I would say on the visually impaired side, you know, it could be as simple as, you know, increased fatigue states, people's proprioception, that type of stuff is off, and running on these trails that are unknown, and, you know, that type of thing. They can twist an ankle easier. But in terms of coaching Nate, so with his impairment, his recovery profile is a bit different. We have to be very careful with how he recovers from CNS type activity, central nervous system type activity, and, you know, just in general, that with the load, he's at sea level, the spacing of workouts, the timing of workouts is a bit different than might be with other athletes. So at altitude, and I don't think he minds me telling the story, but the very first time he wasn't actually training with us at the time, or training with me, but he went up and did a stint on his own. And when I met him up there, he was almost slurring his speech. Like, you know, he was incredibly fatigued. And so, you know, with him in particular, we would ensure that the monitoring is going well in the first acclimation week, and that he's actually really, you know, adapted to the point that we can start to hit some of we'll take our time with it, keep things a bit more aerobic, maybe more so than some of the other athletes. And then the spacing of recovery. So I would probably have less density in the program than I would with some of the other athletes, and just ensure that, you know, that, and again, it comes back to monitoring, just making sure that he's spaced things out enough that he's hitting the stimulus, but he's also recovering.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. So again, yeah, like it sounds like, you know, there's not a just like at the altitude plan and then you just kind of go and do it. It's very individualized. In terms of timing, I think when people think of altitude, mostly, you know, people tend to think of go to altitude and then come down and do a race. So that would be sort of this, you know, the competitive phase. But are there ideal periods in the season to implement altitude training? You know, does it look different if you go preseason versus end of season, that sort of thing? How do you mentioned actually 3 times a year, like as kind of an ideal thing. So how do you see that?
Yeah, I'm gonna take a crack at that and then pass it over to Heather. You know, we also have to realize that there's a bunch of like kids and teenagers and families and athletes that just live at altitude in Flagstaff or Albuquerque, and so that's just their norm, right? So it's you know, how they phase it, and it's more like the reverse. They're going to phase out and at different times. But for sure, and I think the word intent has come up a few times. You need a purpose and an intent for when and where the camp's going to be. What are you looking for? What are the adaptations you're looking for? What are you giving up at home to go to this camp? You know, what structures do you have around you? Are you able to get therapy? Do you have access to a weight room? You know, all of these things need to go into a decision matrix about whether or not you go into a training camp of any location or not. And you know, what's the risk reward benefit of that? And certainly a fall camp is going to have a lot more intent, or a lot different intent than a camp that's in the spring versus a camp that's, say, midsummer before a championship. And in some instances, a camp in the fall may be used as a fitness booster. There's a lot of aerobic work. And I've seen instances where then, you know, at the tail end of the camp, you actually start tapering a little bit at the camp to be able to come back to sea level and use that boost to just really nail some awesome, like 2 or 3 weeks of sea level training. So then when you put it together, you got like a 6-week block that has a real like purpose to it. You're boosting some physiology at altitude. then using that boost to just really translate a block onto the track afterwards. Obviously, like a pre-competition camp's a little bit different. You got to be a little more cautious with your training loads because you need to come out and race. You're not going to be pushing as much. There's more of an anaerobic domain. So with those camps, and if you're a middle distance runner up to the 5,000, you probably need to pick a location where you can train down. Because you need to hit the specificity. And by training down, I'm talking about, at Flagstaff, you can drive down to lower altitudes in Sedona or Cottonwood, or if you're at St. Moritz, you can go down into Italy to train at sea level. So you can hit that very specific work you need to do in the spring and summer. In the fall, that's less necessary. You have other options there. You can probably stay up for most of the training and be just fine because you're not cranking 1K repeats on the track at 5K goal pace at that point. So those are probably the big things, the macro elements, the quick and dirty on thinking about when and where to put camps and what some of the scientific or some of the more physiological benefits that you're looking for.
That makes sense. Heather, can you maybe add to that too, like in terms of length, like how long, usually you would go for at different times of year?
Yeah, I think Trent just did a great job of kind of summarizing that. It's in the fall. And I think one of the principles too to keep in mind is that repeat exposure and slingshotting those training gains, as Trent alluded to, it's really beneficial. Up and come down and train, kind of slingshot the fitness forward, come up again for another, another altitude boost. So in the fall, because of the types of training, more aerobically based, less intense, you could stay up there 6 weeks, you could stay up there a couple months, you could go up for 5 weeks, you could, but I would say longer duration, less need for the lower elevation sort of option. And probably you can do at slightly like higher altitudes as well for some of that work. If you're in sort of pre-competition phase, and so we've anchored in the, sort of a well-monitored camp for a number of years now nationally, and that generally falls kind of in the April-May timeframe up in Flagstaff, which is 7,100 feet. What's that in? It's like 2,100 meters, I guess, but which is great. That's a great elevation. And with that, you're probably still looking at some of the blood hemoglobin mass changes. And I think, Trent, correct me if I'm wrong, that's, if you're up there 3 weeks, that's probably minimal. If everything past that, it kind of increases astronomically or exponentially. So 4 weeks is good. 5 weeks, you're going to see even more benefit. The things to keep in mind with that are train camp effect is great, but at some point diminishing returns on that, and there's a crossroads, people getting cumulative fatigue, and you don't want to carry that into a season as well. So it's great to look on a piece of paper and see your hemoglobin mass is increased, but you want fresh athletes as well that are, carrying major fatigue into the season, or just have gone really stir crazy in ainsi. And so that's something to factor in. And then, in terms of, and then one other element I'll add is a cross event group. So from 800 up through, to the marathon runners, like I think marathon runners or 10K runners or some of the 5K runners probably spend a little longer there because of the type of work they're doing. Whereas, if you're 815, it might be slightly shorter duration just based on some of the types of training and fatigue. And then people are a bit more tentative to use at final phase. And the timing of that has to be very precise because either you're going to compete in the first altitude window coming out, or, in your slots. So maybe you're going into a hot climate to compete and you want to look at actually combining with a bit of a heat camp as well. Are you competing in the second altitude window and, kind of getting that nailed? I personally, I think you can go for quite shorter duration there for the exact reason that we're talking about earlier, the muscle buffering capacity. And so, you've already got the benefit of having accumulated some altitude time through the year potentially, and then go up and you kind of get this boost in the lactic buffering piece. And as Trent said, you want to 100% do your more intense race pace intervals at sea level and the quality work at sea level. So hopefully that helped a bit.
Yeah, you mentioned some windows. Can you explain the first and second windows? I think that's the question people want to know is like when you come back, how do you time the races?
But I think that's also like duration of event or sorry, duration length of the event. So I think you're a bit more stable coming out if you're the longer distance you are. So I think most people be more comfortable in the longer events coming down and competing right away, and we see that quite a bit. You become a little bit, for a number of reasons, you're a little more unstable and unpredictable coming down as an 8 and 15 runner. And those altitude windows, so it's proven that first sort of 24 to 72 hours of coming down is a decent window to compete. But again, a little bit more variability there. And then as you move into the first week down kind of thing, that sort of 4 to 5 day range is quite unstable, and really there's a blackout time you don't want to compete. And it reopens again. I'd say on the very early side of it at about 10 days out from coming down. And then probably, between some people use the sort of 14-day mark down, but I think anywhere between 10 and 21 days, I think is there's some controversy about it. That's kind of the window people work within. And yeah, Trent, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think those are the general themes, and again, highly individualized, as we've mentioned. And when you come down from altitude, one of the compensatory effects that happen at altitude is you do hyperventilate. There's less oxygen, and that hyperventilation continues at sea level, which can be a negative effect initially for the middle distance events, as Heather was mentioning. If you're a marathon runner, you're not at peak ventilations. So it's much less. A lot of marathoners can come straight out and compete quite well within a window. I think, like, if you look at some of the Kenyans and the world records, they're competing at day 5, 6, 7 coming into Europe. Now that's a different paradigm where they're used to altitude, and it is the marathon. So I would agree totally that the middle distance athletes, because they're at maximal ventilations, there's some biomechanical readjustments that need to occur. They're a little more temperamental, unpredictable when you first come out, and you'll definitely see more stable performances, after about 10 days. The final piece that I'll highlight on this is the relative perceived training load at a set training volume, or intensities, can be 5 to 15% higher for an athlete. Like, it just feels that much harder. And I think a lot of us as coaches have a pretty individualized and dialed in taper sequence that we use at sea level, and then we just take that sequence and just put it up into altitude, and we forget to dial it back a little bit more because load is higher. And so I do believe a lot of athletes come out of, even with a taper at an altitude, more fatigued than a taper at sea level, because those adjustments probably haven't been made enough. And so, is that initial phase where someone bombs a race, is that the fault of the altitude, or the fault that maybe the taper wasn't, quite significant enough? Who knows? It's tricky, and again, individualized, and yeah, I agree generally with those themes.
Okay, so on the topic of individualization, and that this needs to be intentional and having a plan, what kind of testing do you recommend doing, kind of before, during, and potentially after, to sort of make sure that, the levels are all good across various things, and how important is the IST team, that's redundant, IST, on site, or at least, like, before and after? How does that what kind of things are we looking at there?
Yeah, I might, from a physiology, nutrition, and medical side, say that there's a bunch of must-haves and there's some nice-to-haves. And in talking to a colleague who's Robert Chapman at USA, he had mentioned in the last 10 years, upwards of 50% of their American athletes don't even supplement iron at altitude. And so they're just not taking care of the basics, or they don't even get blood work done before they go to altitude. And that's just low hanging fruit. So, we would recommend, 4 to 6 weeks out, getting a blood test done, understanding where your blood parameters are, understanding where your hemoglobin is, understanding where your iron studies are, your ferritin and your iron stores. And then from that, a physician and your registered dietitian can make some recommendations about what kind of iron supplement and what kind of protocol you should do at altitude. Iron is required and part of hemoglobin mass production. So every hemoglobin has 4 irons on it. If you don't have enough iron, you're not going to get as much hemoglobin gains at altitude. I would also recommend, it's very simple at sea level, is getting some external and internal load metrics established. And by that, what I mean is just what is your heart rate and RPE or lactate at easy run and threshold pace at sea level before going? When you get up to altitude, I think we'll get into that later, you initially want to dial it back, but you can use your heart rate and your RPE to guide training. Yes, paces will be slower, but and very quickly the paces will adapt after about a week and start coming back up. But use your sea level heart rate, sea level RPE. If it's a threshold, you should be 5 out of 10, not 8 out of 10 at altitude. And just having some good pace intensity discipline when you arrive. And then the third piece that I'll highlight is ideally you have some element, especially if you're very new, of just day-to-day tracking of fatigue, hydration status, heart rate or heart rate variability, and potential O2 saturations. And if you can layer all those in and track that over time too, you're much more likely to have something in place where that if an athlete is getting close to the edge of the cliff, you can pull them back and you've got some metrics to make some decisions with. So those are my kind of must-haves. There's a whole bunch of other nice to haves like hemoglobin mass or, some of the other things that we've had the opportunity to do. But those are my main must-haves. That and a really good communication with the coach.
Yeah. Heather, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I agree with all of that. I think it's the consensus is there amongst coaches, amongst sports scientists that enhanced protocols are difference makers. And I think all of us that have been at camps before and have seen other groups come in and things like that, like we've seen casualties, we've seen people not closely monitored, as Trent said, come in, low iron status, not understand how to monitor during acclimation week, and just not quick feedback loops in terms of addressing when there's fatigue built up. So all of those things, like you don't have to have fancy equipment, but you do need to sort of understand, like resting heart rate's really easy thing to get in the mornings. If you can have a way of, you can do it visually, track your hydration status. All of those type of things are just incredibly important in terms of decision-making process. Yeah.
Yeah, like on average, for example, resting heart rate will go up 5 to 10 beats in the first few days from sea level. So you need sea level to compare to again. And by the end of week 1, it'll almost normalize if you've adapted well. At the end of week 1, if you've done your first big workout, guess what? On Sunday, it'll be back up by about 5 to 7 beats, but it should come back down on Monday. Then you can see you're adapting well. So that's a pretty simple one. If it just stays up and it's pinned at 10 beats and the athlete's feeling like crap, that's good feedback that you need to dial things back.
And as Trent said, the baselines, like if you can understand yourself physiologically or understand your athlete physiologically at sea level, you'll be able to understand them better at altitude. And so, you can use general ideas around pace adjustments and things like that. But also, like you can do, if you consistently during threshold training or whatever, getting lactates just to check in, that's obviously a really good measure up at altitude as well. So I think establishing the baselines early, understanding your athlete right across the board metabolically, then you can just translate that up to altitude as well.
Awesome. So we mentioned a few times this first week of training. So let people want to know about the training. So what does that look like the first week? For someone, say, going up for the first time, and then maybe if someone has some experience, if that's any different. Heather, maybe you can start.
I
What do
yeah, I
you
can sort
usually
of,
have?
I think, you know, for newer athletes, I mean, I remember some of the stuff I prescribed was just so cautious because I wanted them to be scared, like not scared, but I wanted them to be respectful, you know, of what they, you know, of the altitude. And so, you know, even things like you go out for an easy run, you know, really scale it back and give them some parameters around that. And you hit a hill, like it's okay to walk the hill in week one. It's okay. It's okay to, you know, really shorten those runs up, you know, in the first day or two. And so, but basically in the first week, in that week, you can work both ends. So you can, you know, you want to keep your lactate down, you know, so a lot of easy running, you could probably get a threshold workout in, but keeping it very aerobically based. But you can also probably integrate a little bit of speed in there. Like you could do a little bit of quicker stuff just to keep the, you know, try to get that activation patterns in. But staying away from any max efforts, any big VO2 workouts, any big race pace workouts, that type of thing. If someone's really adapting nicely, typically what I would do is kind of that first weekend, say we went up on a Sunday, then but by the next Saturday, you go down to sea level and, you know, get the benefit of sea level, or not sea level, sorry, but lower elevation, down sea level, but lower elevation, and then test things out with some maybe more specific work, and maybe it's a VO2 session or whatever, but you're really looking at increasing the recovery time. Sometimes it's double. So if it was a minute recovery, it might be 2, and chunking the interval length. So those are the 2 major ways that I would sort of moderate. And that'll give you some information in terms of the next steps in the following week. But you know, in the next week, you might look at maybe not quite as much recovery time, but it still might be, you know, sort of adding 50% or whatever. But I would almost double it in the first week and try to hit, you know, some race paces potentially, or some, you know, some of the more quality work. And pace adjustments is the other thing that you can look at. So say it was a VO2 session, and someone wanted to do 1200 or something like that, you know, they may end up doing some 8s. So chunking it, more recovery, and adjusting the pace. The other major thing on that sort of first workout down, maybe in the first week, is at the end of the week, is definitely managing expectations around it. Sorry. I just lost my train of thought there. Sorry.
Managing expectations on the first week.
Definitely managing expectations, but being very well, I guess being able to, as a coach, intervene very quickly and make adjustments. I think that's one thing too, because you'll see the point where someone's sort of doing well, and then needs to kind of make an adjustment, and preparing them for that you might intervene and say, hey, we're going to chunk this a bit more. We're dropping down to 400 instead of 8s. And sorry, I got my thought back, which was easing into workouts. So if you have a bandwidth you want to hit, starting on, really encouraging people to start off cautiously and working into the pace. I think that's the other thing that I would recommend. Trent, anything about the first week?
No, I think for newcomers, that's good advice. And for those that have been many times, they're still gonna, I think, be cautious those first few days because of just hydration and hyperventilation and some extra stress and stress responses that occur. You tend to poor sleep initially. But on the aerobic piece, it can sometimes jump into it a little quicker. They still have to respect the anaerobic piece a little more. But yeah, I think those are all good pieces. The combo that I've seen sometimes derail a few people early is they've been there a week. You know, they come Sunday, they take it easy, they go down on Saturday, nail a workout, and then it goes really well because it's down and they've respected everything. They've done a massive workout, and then they come back up and they do an hour 45 long run that ends up with a bunch of friends, that ends up being a threshold workout on Sunday. And so it's like a bam up, and so it's like a bam bam. And that that's something that I've sometimes that combo, that first weekend combo, I've seen go sideways a few times.
That makes sense. And then so then after that, once you're sort of, safely acclimatized and you're into the stay, and you want to do, some harder, some key workouts, how do they look? Like, are they sort of same, sort of same workouts as sea level, but just, maybe different paces, or are you trying to do something different with the load? Like, what's sort of some key workouts for, let's say, for middle distance, like 1,500, 800 people, once they've acclimatized and they're ready to do some work?
I mean, I think one of the keys is at what point in the season is it? Like, I mean, you're the same things you want to achieve at sea level, you're hopefully achieving at altitude. So it's the intent of what you want to achieve, and it'll look very different, obviously, in the fall from sort of pre-competition phase or as a final phase piece. And so those workouts will look quite different. But again, I think those three pieces is you're looking at, some of the longer and stuff that maybe some pace adjustments. But hopefully in the second to third week, you're actually getting closer to actual specific paces on specific work. And again, if you've doubled the recovery in the second and third week, you're probably going to start to notch that down. And maybe it's a little bit more recovery, or maybe you've chunked the workout enough so you reduce the intervals. You can kind of keep in, you're playing with the recovery a bit, and you're keeping it shorter, but you've chunked the workout. So, yeah, I mean, I think you're going to want to obviously hit the key sessions that you want to hit. So with, say it's a 1,500 meter runner, there's probably in there's a VO2 session. You're going to want to deliver that and hit the same, actually get the same physiological adaptation, but just might look a little bit different given those parameters. And for those type of things, you're probably going to want to go down to lower elevation to try to keep as much quality there. I think one of the things that I'm mindful of is that, if you're slowing paces down, there's a neuromuscular impact to that. And you want to keep that patterning in. And so personally, I try to keep race paces, and even with the VO2 work, I try to actually not make as much of a pace adjustment, like hopefully, but chunk things a little bit more and try to keep that stimulus in. Yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add there, Trent.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with that. I'm glad you added in the biomech piece. I think in April and summer camps, you want the speeds close to the goal race paces. So you have to have an option to go down. As non-native Highlanders, as sea level athletes, I would argue in a 3-week camp, if you stay at altitude of 2,000 meters, it's gonna be impossible to hit 5,000 meter race pace at altitude in intervals longer than 1,200. It'll be very difficult to do that at 2,000 meters. You have to chunk it up. It's too big of an ask within 3 weeks to try to do that. When you go down to Chiavenna, which is 700 meters of altitude, of course you can nail it. Maybe by week 3 in an experienced athlete, and it's a 5,000 meter workout down in Sedona, which is 1,200 meters. So there's still a slight hypoxic effect. You can get pretty close to those long intervals, mile repeats or 1,200s as sea level paces, but you got to be patient with it. In most instances, chunk it up and sometimes the micro recoveries can be awesome. Like, instead of mile repeats, maybe it's 1,000 with a 600, but it's just a 1 minute rest, bam, bam, and then you take a set break. And so you're still kind of getting that mile duration with a little micro break in the middle, and so you're still getting that duration of running.
Good, yeah. So I mean, the themes, it seems like, be intentional and pay attention and monitor the athlete, see what they need, and obviously like a reasonable progression as you're getting them there, and then you're not going to just sort of all of a sudden switch to like, okay, full workout, let's go. You need to make sure that they can actually do it. You mentioned 2,000 meters, so this was I think an audience question. What is, like, how high does it need to be high altitude? Like, what's 2,000 meters is where you want to be, or is there a range? What should people be looking for?
Yeah. Rob Chapman actually published a paper on this in Runners, where they sent runners to multiple altitudes and then looked at their blood response. And actually, I think it was 3,000-meter race response. And there does seem to be a sweet spot, about 1,800, 2,000 meters up to about 2,400 meters. And if you look at all the top spots around the world, they're all kind of in that sweet spot. In the fall, you might go to a spot that's a little bit higher, but it comes at a big recovery cost. It comes at a big running intensity or pace specificity cost. You're death marching at high altitudes. It's hard to do. So, and if whether it's Albuquerque or St. Moritz or Flagstaff or Boulder or Monmouth, or we can go through all the European sites. They all tend to fit pretty nicely in that 1,800 to 22 to 2,400 meter window.
Is there a Canadian site? Like, is there somewhere in the Rockies that gets high enough?
There is for cross-country skiers. So Canadian Sport Institute Calgary does have a location with a hut up there on a glacier. Unfortunately, the way our Rockies are, there's just not a really ideal spot. There is close to altitude in Big White, which is near Kelowna. It's just right on the cusp there, but it's just so vertical that like John Gay was up there during COVID, and I think they had like a 2-mile loop, and that was it. Like he just had to run 2-mile loops because it was on a mountain, and it was either up or down. And so that's our problem, is we don't have a lot of easily accessible plateaus at 2,000 meters that aren't covered in snow.
Yeah, I actually did a site visit up in Big White during COVID, or like around that time, because we were obviously not able to travel, and knew that there were some Canadians that spent a little bit of time up there. It's as Trent said, like I think the highest point that I had my little thing, and I was figuring out the elevations, and to sleep, you want to sleep at 1,800, right? At minimum. And I think there was at the very peak at one point, like there was 1,800 meters. But there is an ability to get down to a lower elevation because you can drop down to Kelowna, I guess. But the track, like there's a track down there. But as Trent said, the just massive amount of hills, and so not really, I would say, an ideal like training location necessarily, given what some of the other locations have to offer if you can travel.
What about tents, altitude tents? That was really popular for a while there, and then it seemed to sort of fade away. What's the proper protocol for altitude tents if they are indeed useful?
Yeah, so scientifically, I think the major challenge with tents is just accumulating the hypoxic stress. And so you're really lucky in a week to get 70 hours in a tent. When you think about the sleeping, and unless you have a really big tent, you can go in there and hang out or read in the mid-afternoon or have another nap, versus it's more than double of that when you go to natural altitude, because you're just in it all the time. And so there are altitude houses like at the Australian Institute of Sport where they've done a lot of research. And again, I think the major difference is the accumulated hypoxic dose. The other downfall of tents is that a lot of them can be quite stuffy and hot and harder to sleep in because you got to zip them up. We've all camped on a warm summer night. There's a generator, there's a noise factor, but sometimes you can set those out in the hallway. So yeah, there's some pros and cons to those. There is some data suggests that using a tent in the lead up to an altitude camp helps with adaptation. And there is one paper that came out showing that the hemoglobin, the red blood cell masses that you gained at the camp, can be maintained longer by using an altitude tent after the camp. But yeah, so it's like a cost benefit analysis, and it depends on what you're doing and where you're at and your personality and the mileage that you're doing. He's put this into interviews, like Cam Levins uses a tent a lot. He likes to stay at home with his wife in Portland, and so he does implement a tent for sleeping, and then he also has a tent over a treadmill. So he does a bunch of running in a tent at altitude as well in Portland. So it's his way to still be connected with his family and his partner, but create a hypoxic stimulus. But it is putting a treadmill in a tent and just staring at the wall. pretty mentally challenging. But Cam can do it. He's a special athlete.
Yeah.
I think there's a number of groups and athletes as well that they've got their sort of ambient altitude, like their altitude camps penciled in, and then they sort of bridge those potentially, as Trent said, with artificial altitude. And I think the other thing that's done sometimes too, which is much more comfortable, is potentially adjusting, say, a room someone's staying in. So say it was St. Moritz and it's at 6,000 feet, like it's kind of just at that cusp, 1,800 meters. But potentially you sleep higher because there's an adjustment in terms of creating an artificial altitude room. So those are the types of things that are done.
All right, so we've got 5 minutes left. I think we've hit on a whole bunch of questions. I had 2 more questions. Hopefully we can get to both of them. One is maybe more for Trent, and Heather could probably answer it too. So I'll ask this one first. How have the training protocols evolved over the last, it's like 10 to 20 years? I guess 10 years since it was 2014 is when you started going up, Heather, but just sort of, how has the thinking changed, just to, in case people maybe have some sort of vestigial ideas about altitude, make sure that we give them the, how things have evolved.
You want me to take that first?
Yeah, like just, some old ideas that have moved on.
Yeah, there's been a pretty decent upswing in research that's been done at altitude in the last 20 years. So like a concept like live high, train low didn't exist 20 years ago. It was right on the cusp of existing 20 years ago. The idea to try to sleep as a high, but then you can drop down to the valley to do your quality work and then go right back up high. I think the elements of the dose response, how long you need to stay for red blood cell changes, potentially how long you need to stay for muscle buffering and blood buffering, that's become a lot more known. So you can start to plan and periodize that way. And then the last big element that I'll highlight is that I think our ability to track and monitor athletes and the value of that has improved a lot more, to, as we talked about, in terms of making sure athletes stay on the right side of the correct side of the mountain and the cliff. They don't fall off the cliff. Those are probably the big things that I've seen over the last 20 years. And by tracking them, it's morning heart rates, it's speed, it's lactates, it's all those factors and when and where they fit in.
This might be a bit speculative, but do you think that, the kind of idea of responder, non-responder maybe was more a bit of like not, properly tracking and not really knowing what was going on, but then with proper tracking, you can kind of make sure that everyone is a responder in some sense? Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, so there's a couple papers on responders and non-responders, again, from our friends in the US, Robert Chapman, and responders and non-responders aren't consistently responders and non-responders because the context of the camp changes each time. Context being how healthy they are, what do they come in, do they get ill, are they hammerheads, what time of the year is it? All these factors can change just like the kind of sea level, a training response. And so as long as you're accounting for those, I do believe that the vast majority of athletes can be positive responders one way or another. But not always. Like for some athletes, spending 3-4 weeks away is miserable for them. They don't like it. They've gotten sick before. It doesn't work for them. And so trying to ram a square peg into a square, or a round peg into a square hole doesn't make sense necessarily for all athletes. So I think we need to be open-minded to that. And but for a lot of athletes, I do think as part of your athletic journey, especially if you're a senior level endurance athlete, you should look at altitude as seriously as something to add to your tool belt and to give it a chance on a few exposures and a few very well supported exposures before you just say, no, that's not for me.
Well, okay, last question for Heather. We talked about this a bit before. What are some of the adjacent benefits to altitude? Like not just, those sort of physiological stuff, but like the fact that, that you're in a nice place and the training camp and stuff. How can athletes kind of, I don't know, use that to kind of get the most out of their experience?
Yeah, I think I what we were speaking about earlier was just training camp effect, partially. And so, that a new environment, professionalism around some of the monitoring pieces, knowing you've got to be dialed in to get it right. you know, those are all beneficial. Getting around a cohort, like one of the things that's been exceptional, I found, and this is just amongst Canadians, but amongst internationals as well, is just the willingness to work together, and people getting together for runs. And so there's, you know, a collegial feel and a companionship sometimes. But I think I mentioned earlier, the training camp effect can diminish over time, and there's a crossroads where people start to get a bit fatigued. But also, like, one of the things about altitude is that in order to get high altitude, you're generally up in the mountains, and, you know, it's beautiful scenery. Same where it's a stunning Flagstaff, it's, you know, blue skies, pine forests, and it can be quite calm, and I think perspective shifting and peaceful. And so I have noted athletes that go in for, say, final phase preparation example. It's just a really good way to get focused, get dialed in, and then obviously, hopefully, enter into a little bit of chaos before they go into the full deal. But just to get kind of acclimated to what it's going to be like in a, you know, in a village or at a championships. But so yeah, those are some of the things. I think one of the others is from a work effort perspective, it's the grind. Altitude is real, and coming out of that and the confidence of the work you put in, the mental toughness around it, and then coming down, you know, feeling at ease, you know, with a bit more oxygen. That's a big benefit as well. So.
Cool. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you both so much. We're right at 8:01, 5:01 on the West Coast. So we've hit our time, but yeah, thanks again. Just such a wealth of knowledge, really great in-depth answers. Really appreciate it. I think that our coaches appreciate it as well. And you know, so this will be up on YouTube, you know, probably by tomorrow, as soon as Kyle's able to get it up there. And so can share it and people can watch it again. But thank you, and hope to see some people back at for the next one about rules with Jane in February. So thank you both. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night. See you around.